The panel, Sam, Udi, Chris, why don't you introduce yourselves and we'll go from there.
You go first.
So my name is Chris Patterson. I work at McKesson Healthcare. I've worked there for quite a while. I do a lot of distributed systems architecture for a lot of healthcare interoperability systems. So a lot of the work that I do has to deal with building and creating applications that connect all the different participants in healthcare, whether it's a doctor, lab system, clinical system, patient reporting system, analytics system, just anything that's dealing with data in a healthcare setting.
So when you're sick, it's his fault.
No, I just make sure your doctor knows you're sick.
And I talked to you from before, so you know who I am.
I'm Sam Martindale. I run a small consulting firm here in the city, as well as in Dallas, Architecting Innovation. We specialize in distributed systems and distributed systems architecture, and basically coming in and helping companies unbuild some of their monoliths, and hopefully, in most cases, some of their monolithic teams we were talking about earlier. So that's what we do.
That's great. I think, look at the presentation. One of the big things that comes to my mind, you talked a little bit about getting a team from, they might be on, like you described, a monolithic type of application. They might be putting in the next new thing right now as we speak, with no real idea of the cohesion, the coupling that you talked about. From your experience, between the three of you, you've worked obviously with not only a lot of teams or even teams within your organization, but what would be your advice? You talked a little bit about how an architect might come in and try something really small, a few strings, but you also talked about somebody who comes across as like, this is my job security, and I'm resistant to change. So while this may sound easy, you're also really fighting something pretty strong. Maybe some real world examples of how you've really worked with teams to get them to really try this new idea out.
You want to go first?
I'm trying to think of one.
All right. So since I'm the one that's good at thinking on my feet, because I get lots of questions like this constantly. The how do you start is very situational. But that's the consultant answer to everything, right? It depends is the answer. But 9 times out of 10, when I'm going into an organization, the people will tell me, this is what I think we should do. And I kind of listen to them, and I go to upper management, and I say, this is what I think you should do. Like, oh my God, Udi, you are so brilliant. You've been here all of 5 minutes, and you already understand our problems, and you've recommended solutions that are totally wrong. I'm like, yeah, please sign this purchase order. But part of it, it's, in many cases, organizations know what they need to do, but there's just a fundamental lack of trust in who's presenting the message. And it's enough for somebody to come from the outside and give the exact same message. And then it's frustrating to people who work in the company. Like, but I've been saying that for weeks and months, and nobody listens to me. And then Udi comes along, and then they listen to him. But that's just sort of human psychology. If you've been here long enough, then how good could you possibly be? There is that halo, the perceived halo of somebody coming in from the outside. Doesn't necessarily make them any better suited to figure out what the actual best approach is. So I'd say that the problem isn't so much finding out how to start, it's actually getting the rest of the organization to listen. And sometimes, that's a thing that a person from the outside gives. It's just that external stamp to say that, yes, that's a good way of going about it. And the organization, like, okay, great, let's go do that.
Let's sign. Sam, do you find the same thing? 5 minutes is all the time we need of you?
So no, hardly. So I frankly don't have this clout to be able to get done in 5 minutes. I think is the problem. Dry humor. But normally I think it differs from situation to situation, from company to company. And what I've found a lot is it doesn't so much hinge even upon like the company size, right? So every place I've ever walked into, you kind of have like the rule of thirds, right? Like the third of the people who get it and are with you, and are frankly usually the ones giving you the answer the minute you walk in the door. The third who don't know, aren't sure, could be swayed either way, and the third who are completely against whatever change needs to be made, right? The third who are usually against them are usually, you know, the folks who have some kind of like political stake, right? You know, the
Existing world order.
right, existing world order, pulling the teams apart. You know, let's not build this thing, you know, according to like functional components. Let's build it according to like what the subdomain is, right?
Right.
So, you know, taking that apart, I think, can be the hardest part. And getting some of those folks, and getting some of those folks in the camp, right, is usually the first right step.
I think that's what you see as a consultant, especially the challenge being you're walking into a group of people who haven't solved the problem. And so if you do, that must mean that they really aren't needed anymore, potentially.
Right.
How do you work with those people to sort of mentor them and bring them up? In other words, I think one of the goals of it is sometimes as a consultant is you fall on the sword so that you can make your client look right.
Absolutely, right? I think the answer there has to be that I'm not going to be here for very long, right? So it's you know, the passing the gauntlet experience, right? It has to be about I'm going to build this so that you can go, or I'm going to help you build this rather, right? So that you can take it and carry it forward.
Three, which I know in the Bay Area is like epic that anyone's been in a company for more than like 5 years. But I don't really have that consulting experience. I've had to work with organizations where a lot of times the change had to come from within. There were times, of course, when the company would say, oh, we need to hire some, you know, efficiency experts to come in and reorganize our business so that we can be, you know, more productive. But a lot of times we've had to instill this change within. And it is kind of hard to do, but you do have the different, you know, you have the people that are going to understand what needs to change. You have the other people who are rather ambivalent and they just show up for work and they don't really care what the business does because, you know, they're just there. But you have to, ultimately it's a matter of selling it to upper management because upper management has to allow the business to spend money on something that isn't a feature that's being delivered to a customer. But yet everybody recognizes, you know, look at, you know, I think it was about 3 years ago, maybe 3.5, and this happened, you know, even previously back in like 2006, is we started to recognize things in the business that were causing problems. You know, you have this rolling wave of productivity where you have this vendor model where you have the infrastructure team which sells services back to the product teams. Well, then you have the QA team that's, you know, doing their testing for the product teams, but doesn't really understand, you know, the product delivery cycle and the end-to-end delivery cycle. And you end up with this, you know, again, it's the same kind of thing that Udi was just talking about. You have this layered enterprise that is ultimately delivering something that somebody's going to run in a data center, and the developers have no skin in the game or stake on the ground to say, hey, we're doing end-to-end delivery to the customer. I just wrote some code. I don't need to care what that's going to be like in production. And you have to change the business to kind of do that. But you know, my experience is that I don't get to leave. I've had to like stay there and see this through. So it becomes more of a socializing it so that you're not the one person who's constantly banging the gong, getting people to kind of carry that change. Is you have to get that first third on your side immediately. You have to get the other third energized, and you have to convince management and people that are going to ultimately allow you to say take 3 or 5 months and re-engineer your business. You know, that Kaizen moment where you say, okay, this agile stuff, it was cute in words, Scrum was crap. Now we're going to go to a full flow-based, feature-based application model where we have end-to-end delivery from a product customer idea all the way to monitoring and delivering it in production to the customer and realizing that value so that you're seeing revenue and able to recognize that revenue. It takes an incredible amount of effort, and it's something you can't do on your own. You have to build, you know, essentially that peer group to help make that happen.
I think that's a great point. You know, we talked a little about as developers that we worry about our code and then the coupling and all these fantastic, you know, whatever's the latest and greatest. But one thing you pointed out at the very end was it's also the monitoring. It's the operational aspects, and then you're matching that to revenue. I mean, that's, as a developer, that's fantastic. If you go all the way through that endpoint, because all of a sudden now you've got a very great argument of why you want to do what you want to do. It's not about scalability; it's about revenue. And that,
Supportability.
you know, that's huge. That's absolutely huge.
And being able to argue for a raise. So
Well, ultimately, more revenue.
I can
means
connect
bigger
what
bonuses.
I did to the company making more money.
Yeah.
When I go and say, you know, I deserve a raise, here's why. This is what I deliver. This is the impact that I have.
You sound like management. Great questions. Right back here.
So one thing that struck me about the presentation, Udi, is that we came here expecting something about microservices, and we saw a lot about coupling at the programming level, but what I took away was coupling at the people level. And when you can come into an organization and you're facing, a code base that isn't working, and you often see, a people base that, mirrors that. You mentioned that, talked about projects that take 2 years, to turn around before we can learn from mistakes. As a developer, I can deploy something and, it breaks instantly. How do you start a conversation before it fails, at an organization level, before people are even aware that something is going wrong or going amiss? Where do you start that? You have to have a 2-year time to fail.
I think part of it is just telling the story of history up until that point correctly. It's kind of connecting the dots that everybody had experienced and saying, and we were doing the things exactly this way a certain number of years ago, and we ran into this trap. And several years before that, we saw the exact same symptoms appearing again. So part of it is just giving that narrative. That's what I try to do in my talks. See, I'm not actually telling you anything you don't know. I'm just tying together experiences that you've already got and saying, notice that there's a pattern here. And I'm proposing an explanation for them. But even if my explanation isn't the right one, having a conversation in the organization saying, if we're seeing these same symptoms appear over and over again, then we should allow for the possibility that this time those same symptoms will appear as well. So maybe let's spend some time talking about what we think could contribute to those symptoms. How might we notice them before they totally destroy the project? And just get people to the point where they're saying, okay, even if we don't accept the explanation, we acknowledge the history of these experiences, and that we as a group should probably have an explanation, at least for ourselves, if not to management, as to how this time we're going to prevent those kinds of things from happening again, especially given the fact that we've thought we've done things differently numerous times in the past. So whether it was going from VB6 to .NET, or going from web services to WCF, or going from link to SQL to Entity Framework, or what have you in terms of technological change. Saying we've made a bunch of changes along the way, but those changes didn't seem to deal with these kinds of symptoms. What explanation do we have? We should have an explanation. So I put that challenge to the group as a whole, just to get people on the lookout for, what would it look like if things started to go wrong again? What kind of early warning system could we put in place? So even if it's not prevention per se, or really doing things very different, just getting people to be aware that this will, given the number of times it's happened in the past, it will probably happen again. So let's just be aware of it as it's happening. That would be a conversation that I've had successfully a couple of times.
That's an awesome point. Got that. Scott? Ward, how about you?
If I sort of were trying to, I'll throw this proposition out there, and then we'll see whether you agree. But as I listened to the talk, and as I listened to what you both said, I would say it sounded to me like you were saying that what we have is tightly coupled systems and decoupled organizations. And what you're arguing for is tightly coupled organizations that could lead to decoupled systems. Chew on that. Does that make sense?
The words make sense. I'm not sure that I paint the picture that way.
Well, you were saying that the driving problem here is that you have the silo, you have organizational decoupling, because you've got people working on the API, you've got people working on the database, you've got people working in each of the layers, and they're not all concerned with as you were saying, about delivering an end-to-end product that meets a collective need. And so you were somehow, in one of your diagrams, talking about how really what they should be looking for is sort of cross-cutting organizational cohesion, which can only take place if there is social tight coupling, if you will.
Social cohesion.
Yeah, well, I call that coupling. Well, so anyway, that was an opportunity. Social coupling. Yeah, well, they could be. And thank you, Chris, for that insightful visual image. So I just thought it was
an app for that.
There's an app for that. He's Mr. Tinder. So anyway, I just wondered whether that was where you were what you were driving at, and then that you saw. I'm trying to connect this somehow to what the products you guys offer. All right, service bus, mass transit, which are presumably technologies that somehow are at play in the dynamic you were describing for us. So maybe you can pull those thoughts together. You spent all this time talking about how organizations don't understand how they're really working, there are consequences for the technologies they write. If only they would do something different, somehow that connects to my product. Connect the dots for me.
Well, I think let's split that into a couple parts, because I think I would like to touch briefly on things like a service bus type of architecture. We briefly touched on that. And I'd love to use the Amazon as an example to sort of build on that. But why don't we start with, instead, right now is your concept here of the cohesion within the team. I'm kind of think of this as sort of like the other day I was talking to someone about, okay, yeah, I can work on the mobile all the way to the database, and someone looked at me and said, you're a full stack engineer. And it's like, well, that's a buzzword of, 2014 probably. But the concept there of what you call a coupling of the team. In other words, if I have a feature and I'm working across mobile, I think it was mobile, the portal, and what was the last word, like the reporting or whatever it be. How does that fit in? Would it be like you talk about the team coming together, but is that people who would know the entire full stream of everything? Is that? How does that?
When I talk about an end-to-end delivery of a product, how many people host on-prem still? Like servers, infrastructure, all that stuff? Very few. How many people are hosting in Amazon or Azure or something like that? Okay, so you're actually almost the majority now. So there are still companies, believe it or not, that still build these little enterprises or empires or these little dynasties within the company that try to serve as vendors to people within the company. You have the infrastructure team, which gets to go and build rack servers and build infrastructure and build SANs and build all these things that they consider as a service. They're a vendor back to, say, development or operations that wants to host applications and put them into production. Well, that's a dying world. Nobody's going to be hosting on-prem because even healthcare companies that are super highly regulated are now moving entirely to Amazon or Azure. So the infrastructure team and the people that are racking and stacking servers have been virtualized out of existence. That's happening, but there's still companies that don't do that. When you talk about this end-to-end delivery, and to your point, decoupling or basically creating that cohesive team or that social coupling, you're really talking about end-to-end delivery of a product. You're talking about product-focused companies. Companies used to build products and sell products to customers. Then we started building these little empires within companies, and within next thing you know, we have an enterprise. And enterprise is part of the problem. Then you get into the enterprise and say, oh, we need to have governments. We need to have a single architecture. We need to have the platform data architecture that everything hooks into and everything follows these standards. And that's where it all falls down, because now you have a cross-cutting concern in the concept of governance that's going completely diametrically opposed to delivering a product that has a P&L and a delivery and a value stream that has to realize profits, or else it becomes worthless. So, the startup companies around here, they all get it. They know that they're working, well, most of them are working towards a sale and an exit, but you're getting to the point where you're developing a product that you can then deliver to the customer, and that involves full end-to-end. There is no separation or different routes that have that bridge or that isolation between the two.
Well, we always talk about products. Customers don't want product, they want solutions. And that's great, but then you really need to spread out, because in the end, the customer wants an answer to a bunch of interconnected problems. So to say it's truly no need for a platform, I think it's always to find the right amount of how much gets together to how much you try to get it separated to be fast enough in how you develop. So the second part you said, nobody is hosting themselves. If you take any financial company, I think your statement will be significantly opposite. Because they all host their own data center because they don't trust the cloud. If you go to Europe, you probably have a different issue with the cloud if it's US-based because they will not trust the cloud for legal reasons. So it's always to see what is the use case you try to solve to not be too broad in your statement.
Well, so let's put the cloud thing to one side. I do want to get back to Ward's statement before about this, what is a service, is this kind of part of the question. So I never really liked the term service when it came out because it implied a lot of things in the word itself that that didn't promote a good architectural thinking around it. So, for example, let's say, like I gave that example right at the beginning of the coupling, having two components in the same process, one calling the other, and then separating them out into separate processes. Is the fact that I've introduced a process boundary between these two components, does that logically confer any meaningful architectural property to the second component? Does that make it a service? What does the word service mean then if it's just hosting from a logical perspective? So that element of saying, well, what I have here is a function that's being called. And whether I'm calling the function remotely or I'm calling the function in process, if it's the same function, if it's giving the same functionality, then saying, now calling it a service does not actually change its nature. So saying, well, now it's a web service or a RESTful service, or it's no, architecturally speaking, you've just taken a regular component and turned it into a remotely callable component. Architecturally, in your logical architecture, nothing has changed. So saying that's a service, I don't find that furthers the conversation in terms of analyzing something's architectural properties. So the remote callability of a piece of functionality does not fundamentally change the nature of logical coupling. So that's one element of services that, and in the early days, to be clear, service-oriented architecture was coined in '96, before there even was a web service technology. Remote callability at the time was falling out of favor. That was kind of the tail end of the Corba days, where you had all of this inter-object chit-chat. People said, that does not work. Remote calls are expensive, they're wasteful, we should not promote it. Service-oriented architecture came in as a logical architectural philosophy, not as something that was physical at all. And it was only roughly 10 years later, when web services started to get popular, that people connected dots that actually were coincidental. Service-oriented architecture and web services, the word service in either one of them, neither group was really aware of the other one when coming up with a name for it. And then shit just sort of happened from there. But along the way, there was an interpretation that remote callability is really important. And web services at the time, and since then other technologies, have just made it easier and easier to do that. In many ways, we're kind of circling back to the bad old Corba days, where doing every little thing is going to be a remote call. We tried that. It doesn't work. And saying, well, let's now put that in the cloud, and we'll have it in Docker, and we'll dress it up with something else. Architecturally, it was proven that it didn't work. So that element of saying, how do we deal with coupling, it always starts on the logical side rather than the physical side. And in that area of saying, well, things that logically are supposed to be together, and that we have ample proof that when we've tried to keep them apart, we still have to make changes at every single point along the way. So it really wants to be together. Don't try to keep it apart, either from a code perspective or from a team perspective. Why? Because we've all experienced the friction around it. So that would be the service part more so than the organizational part. But ultimately it's saying, once you introduce the organizational aspects in there as well, saying what exactly is the incremental benefit of having all of the developers that use primarily a specific technology stack, whether it's iOS or Android or C# or Java. What exactly do we get for creating those types of very technology-centric teams? Well, one thing we get is best practices, right? That people learn from each other the right ways to use that technology. However, what we lose along the way is all of the business-specific stuff that the teams use the technology to solve. And the teams as a group tend to turn inward. That's the definition of a team. There is an us versus them dynamic that is immediately created. So part of it is saying, well, the fact that you have 2 iOS developers, but if they're working on different features, and those features don't really require each other in order to work, then putting them in the same team, you're not getting a whole lot of benefit out of it because there's not a whole lot of collaboration between them. The reason why organizations were created as an idea, the theory of the firm from Coase, was that you had lower transactional costs within a group of people than between groups of people. That's why the firm was created. So saying, by putting 2 people together, but they don't really need to talk to each other on a day-to-day basis, and that they could have gotten the best practices from a Friday afternoon brown bag type session.
A meetup like this.
Or a meetup like this. Saying, we have ample other solutions for propagating best practices, to having kind of an internal architecture consultant come in and have conversations with those developers. Show me the code that you're writing. Oh, let me show you this other pattern for solving the problem. But keeping the people that really need to have lots of conversations to get their features working, say, those are the people we need to put in the same group. Right, so that's the organizational cohesion.
That's what I heard you saying. What I heard you saying is that we don't need groups of C# people and F# people and database people.
Correct.
What we need is the people who make the premise and the people who make the targets. Those are the products. But somehow I felt that, and so what you were saying is that instead of building these, when we have them, like all the C# people, all the DBAs, what we end up with is trying to build one massive system that solves all the problems of the organization.
Not a system.
No, that's what people are trying to do, to live that way. What you were looking at and saying, no, there are vertical tranches of essentially subdomains that have their own cohesion. And so the opportunity there is to reorganize along those domains and then split those domains up so that they're separate projects. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
To a large extent, yes.
That's what you were saying too, Chris, right?
Yes.
So, but then...
I would use, the change I would make back to Theo's point, maybe using, instead of the term product, use a term capability or solution or subdomain or something that is less...
So the counter argument comes back as it says, but wait a minute, this is the total company, and you're breaking this all up into these little things, and we all have the same notion of customer. What are you going to do for me? All right, we need to have a single overarching database that owns everything. All right, and otherwise it's all going to go to hell. So I sense that the products you offer, I leave the term service out, but you called it an end service bus, and you call it mass transit, which makes it real easy. It could be anything. But somehow, these things are supposed to be technology helpers in the general strategy of building separate, domain-focused teams. Is that fair? If so, how does it play? That's your...
keeping the organization cohesive is really only within a particular subdomain. It makes absolutely no sense to intermix people that have nothing to do with each other, unless you're in special situations that call for it, right? So I do tend to believe that, those teams aren't necessarily static for the entire lifetime of the organization, right? They might change and flux around, as time goes on and as the organization evolves over time. These technologies, what messaging is really all about, right, is giving you a way to observe loose coupling where it belongs, which is between the subdomains across the system. In terms of having like a master database, this is a waste of time, right? Things like master data management is yeah, sorry.
Sounds good.
It sounds awesome. I don't know what the hell it means, right? Other than being, really, really cool buzzwords on it. Yeah, it sounds like more consultants. Yeah, it does sound like more consultants.
So when you have these vertical stacks, the biggest thing that we decouple, that we use certain tools like messaging for is temporal availability. We know that these vertical stacks are going to have different availability windows. We don't want them to be so tied together that when auditing is down, we can't write to the database, because if I can't synchronously write to the audit table, then I can still meet the business requirements of doing things asynchronously. That's really just a technology solution to that problem. Your point is fair. Your customers want a solution, they want some integration, but what do they want integrated? We've acquired a dozen companies in the past 3 years that have different things to do with healthcare stacks. They all have their own application. The customers want a solution. They're buying 6 different products built by 6 different companies that were acquired through acquisition. What do they want? They want authentication. They want federated identity of their AD. They don't want to have passwords in different systems. They honestly really don't care that the UIs are different, as long as they can share and interoperate between the different systems. They don't want necessarily full integration. They just want to know that when they, for instance, enter patient data in this system, that when they go and look at their analytics, that same patient data is correct and accurate. They don't necessarily want a single UI that they talk to that has all of those vertical stacks packed into it. What they want is synchronization and eventual consistency between those different systems, so that when they're ingesting data here and they're looking at analytics here and they're doing point of care type things here, that those applications are sharing and interoperating data with their systems. But what they don't want is friction of having to log into 5 different web browsers. They want to be able to click links and have it all just sort of work. So you are delivering a solution by putting the cross-cutting things. The way we organize this is we have vertical teams that deal with particular products or particular features of products. And then we call it like the tab, which is the technology board, which we want to bring Mongo into the platform. Okay, well, we already have this and this. Do we really need another key value store that happens to have JSON document structure? Could we use DocumentDB? Could we use Redis? Could we use, we're already using Postgres. It has JSON now. We look at agreeing in terms of things like that are going to be spends or things that we're going to have to support, and agree that, well, you can use that necessarily within that feature because we can't stop you, but bringing it out to, the larger whole or something that we all have to depend upon, those are conversations that we have at that level. And then that group is then responsible for talking to management and doing, talking to accounting, P&L planning, that kind of stuff. So, but the teams within themselves are fairly functional. You still have the groups like the UI group that meets cross-functionally just to say, hey, we were using Angular 1.3, what's our plan to get to 2? Are we going to go to that? Are we going to use Aurelia? Are we going to use something different? Are we going to go React? They're having those conversations at the UI level. The people that actually are using SQL Server, they still have the SQL Server tools groups, and they still kind of talk to each other, even though they're working in separate groups. You have that technical conversation, again, whether it's a brown bag or whatever, they just tend to talk because they talk. But they're still dependent upon separate different product stacks or features within the system. So that communication happens, it's just not the primary organizational alignment of the business.
Great, thanks. Now we had a few more questions.
That's very good. So there were 2 points which came up in this presentation. One of them was accidental complexity. And like you mentioned it as a problem, but I didn't hear how to address it. And so what you were saying a bit, Chris, for me was helpful, because like, so what you do now, you have 50 teams with 100 different stacks. So how do you keep things together, and how do you avoid shooting yourself in the foot by slicing everything vertically? And the flip side of that would be like recoupling is bad, but it's good because like if I have everything in one language, one solution, if it breaks, I know I broke everything. So I'm kind of curious on that And I'm playing devil's advocate. I'm not necessarily advocating that, but like, how do you think about this management of accidental complexity? You said also, for instance, like maybe you should not manage a project, but manage something else. So any thoughts on how to keep things together?
So technological expertise that gets, per language, per technology, whatever, that connects and talks to the various groups. I don't want to call it for the purposes of standardization, but it does help limit the amount of variability between the teams, or at least get a handle on how much variability is actually going on and how much is appropriate. So people that might have been promoted into a C# team lead, Angular team lead, SQL team lead type person, they become the SQL expert, the C# expert, the React expert that operates more as an internal consultant than an actual manager. And they provide that kind of element of commonality. And these various experts get together over time and have discussions over what's actually going on in the organization, how much variability is going on, where does it make sense to kind of loosen it up a little bit more, where does it make sense to kind of rein it in. But that's, that kind of thing has happened in matrixed organizations over many years. It's not a new idea that we're promoting. The first part of your question, I don't remember how it was different from the second part.
It's the same question stated maybe different.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Essentially, how do you manage accidental complexity, and like by how do you avoid just having an explosion of completely independent things where you have no idea what's going on? And so that's
right. So part of it is that these teams don't necessarily operate in a vacuum. Each of them kind of delivering their own thing. There's a certain element. I know you kind of put down Scrum, but just to use a metaphor, even in Scrum, they created the concept of the Scrum of Scrums. But there is some element of looking across the organization. So for a given need that comes in from the business stakeholders, looking at that and saying, is this, remember what I talked about in the session, is this a wrong requirement? Are they presenting us a solution rather than an actual business need? What other ways are there of realizing the actual business objectives? Getting to the point that we understand what the real problem is to solve is at least half the job. And then from there saying, okay, now that we understand what the problem is, the way that that's going to be implemented is Team A is going to do this, and Team B is going to do that, and Team C is going to do this, and that kind of provides the overall solution. Back really quickly to Ward's point before about where does messaging and or service bus technology comes in. A lot of times it's for that, the connecting the dots between these otherwise autonomous groups. Saying, after this has been done over here, there is another piece that needs to be done. In the past, that might have been done through sort of a more monolithic orchestration across a very large business logic layer. What we move to a model is some fragment of business logic does its piece of highly consistent domain-specific work. After it completes it, it would publish an event saying, I did X. And then one or more other business domains would trigger off of that, say, oh, if you did X, that means I need to start my Y process. And it does its own little micro-orchestration, does the things on its own business logic and data. When it finishes its part, it says, okay, I did Y. Y is now done. We have something else that's sitting there. We're saying, okay, X was done, and now Y was done. Now all I need to do is wait for Z to be done as well, and then I do my last piece of the puzzle. So when you have that kind of event-based interaction, and I think we've all seen that, even from an in-process programming perspective, the observer pattern is one of the most loosely coupled types of logical interaction between two pieces of code as compared to, say, a direct method call on an object. So it's just taking that same philosophy of event-based programming and applying that on a larger scale. Does that kind of connect the two dots for you?
So I'm going to take. I get the impression that some people throw up a bunch of microservices and say, "Hey, I'm doing SOA," and I'm starting to realise. So I'm kind of curious to kind of reconcile the term microservices with SOA. And I think what I'm coming to the conclusion is that actually people just throw out the term microservices and say, "I'm doing SOA," but what they haven't done is a hard work of defining what that business boundary is and what that domain is. And all they're doing now is, as you probably started at the beginning of your talk, is they're just exchanging a monolithic thing for actually a distributed thing, and they haven't actually gone any further, and they haven't done the hard work of defining what a business boundary is, what needs to go on the site now. I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to reconcile in my head with these buzzwords.
Well, there's a great tweet that I saw just a couple of days ago that I retweeted. It's from architect Clippy. You remember Clippy, the MS Office helper?
Ah, you're right, resume.
And then it says, I see you're creating a tightly coupled monolith. Would you like me to decompose that into a tightly coupled set of microservices for you? But it is, it does kind of follow that same type of model that, but this isn't specific to microservices or SOA. I mean, with domain-driven design, people read the first 3 chapters of Eric's book, and they said, cool, entities, value objects, repositories. That's DDD, and they're off to the races. Saying, he wrote an extra 300 pages for a reason. There's more to it than just those little bits. They're like, yeah, it's kind of boring.
It's not hard stuff.
Yeah, so strategic design and bounded context and subdomains, yeah, whatever. Let's just do entities, value objects, and repositories. So, I mean, the hard work of mapping out the real problem domain has existed from the beginning of software. And it doesn't really get any easier. Focusing primarily on technology does not actually help us map out the problem domain better. So whether you say, I'm doing SOA, or I'm doing domain-driven design, or I'm doing object-oriented analysis and design, or I'm doing, BDD, DDD, CDD, TDD, whatever DD of the day it is, ultimately it comes back to the very fundamental thing, understanding what is the real problem to solve, and then finding an appropriate solution to that. So, I agree that the term itself, microservices versus SOA versus DDD versus whatever fad of the month we have, many times they all kind of fall back to the same thing, understand the problem. SOA, one of the big things that was talked about was IT business alignment. Along the way, somehow that kind of got lost in a sea of web services. Then REST came along, and it was about resources. And then people do, get, post, put, delete on top of resources. And what are those resources? Entities, right? We have customer resource, and we have this resource and that resource. Just kind of wrap it up differently. So, if anything, I'd say don't worry so much about what you call it, whether you use the term service or you don't use the term service, whether you call it DDD or you call it something else. The hard part, as always, is getting the right requirements, and I don't want to say that business people don't make it easy on us, but there are certain elements of organizational dysfunction that happen that when you try to have a conversation about what the real business objective is, you might get pushed back in the form of just shut up and build what I tell you. And if that's the kind of culture that you're in, it takes quite a bit of organizational and linguistic jujitsu to kind of work against that. One of the models that works well is, just to make sure that I don't screw up what it is that you really want me to do, because I have a history of hearing things wrong and remembering them differently than what was described. What you're really trying to solve is X, right? And I say, no, that's not it at all. The reason I want to do this is such and such. So you keep kind of putting yourself in the, in some cases you might even do this intentionally, to misinterpret what it is that they're asking you to do, to kind of feel around the edges of what they really need without getting them to the point of realizing that you're moving them away from the original solution that they prescribed. And there's nothing like giving them credit for the idea that you've had for the solution to their problem. And it's not only giving credit, but you want to heap on the, and if we do it, like, I didn't realize it when you originally said it, but if we do it that way, then we solve this problem, that problem. That really is an elegant solution. You just make them sound really smart by misinterpreting what they said originally and just giving them the credit for it. Most types of people that fall into that organizational dysfunction model tend to respond well to that kind of interaction.
Opine, is WCF dead?
Don't you work in healthcare? Don't you know that the IAG protocols are built around SOAP, so you have to use WCF? It's definitely not dead. RPC is there. I mean, I go to a lot of meetups around the city, and I go to a lot of them that aren't .NET. And whether it's XML over HTTP or JSON over HTTP, it's still RPC. And you have the same temporal coupling issues with RPC, whether it's XML or JSON. You know, it's these auto-process method calls that are happening between systems.
I'd also argue that actually you want to get coupled to the teams written that other service, because if it's slow, then it's a service will couple to the development cycle and everything else.
Right, so when you talk about why do we use messaging and things like that, we couple around what we know are going to be bottlenecks. If we know an external service is going to have a 3-second response time, and that is something that we don't need to do other parts of the systems that need lower response times, you can fan out, you can distribute, and you can correlate different things all through asynchronous coordination and tools like that. So that's a case where queues are used even within the same domain, because within your domain you have control, but you can't control the response time of calling an insurance company to find out if Frank is eligible for a heart transplant, or to find out if someone is going to have a drug interaction with some particular thing. You can't control the availability of these external services. And then talking about these other meetups, I see these companies, Twilio is a little different, but when you talk about Shanahan's company, what is their company? RuneScope or whatever it is? RuneScope, the one that does like all the webhook management and API management type tools for communication. Isn't it RuneScope? RunScope, not RuneScope. RuneScope is like a game for kids or something. But you have all these things like webhooks, so you go and you use like GitHub or any of these services that have these webhook callbacks. When you go to the very early primitive models, they're saying, oh, something happened in our business logic code, we'll just trigger another thread to go out and call and do that webhook. Well, if that webhook delivery is unavailable, well, now that thread is sitting there thinking what it has to do, and then the next thing that comes up is, I know, we'll write it into a Redis list, and then we'll have another process that reads from that Redis list and makes all these webhooks for us. Well, that's not really working, because then when you read it from the list, so then you have these double-ended lists. I saw a thing at Silicon Valley Code Camp where all these people were going to all this work with Redis to basically reinvent RabbitMQ in Redis. And then finally they're like, hey, guess what? We just switched to RabbitMQ, and now we're doing this, and now our Redis server is available to do other data store type things that it's supposed to do. So eventually you get to where you need that temporal decoupling more than it's a matter of business decoupling, because you can't control the availability of all these external true services that have wild dependencies that you couldn't possibly pull into your application that you need to depend upon.
We're going to have to wrap it up here. I was going to say, in 30 seconds, do you have any closing statements? One piece of advice you can give everyone? Anyone here?
You can just
I'll put you on the
I'll go,
hook.
then you can go, and then maybe you can close it up.
Your 30 seconds.
I'd like to thank Udi for coming out. I thought it was great conversation, great presentation, and great questions tonight. follow the right people on Twitter. It's like RSS is dead, but every day I see somebody tweet something that ends up in Pocket and I end up reading on an airplane somewhere that people are doing new cool things all the time. So don't just assume that what you saw being done 2 years ago that was really cool is actually what you're going to think is cool in a year. So stay current.
I'm not going to close with any advice. I just want to, thanks for having me, and it's always an honor to speak, in great company. So,
Great, thanks, Sam.
My call to action? Well, I mean, Ward was constantly setting it up about my product, my product, my product. If you are interested in messaging and you are using .NET and Service Bus is a great way to start. Thank you, Ward. Mass Transit, also a great solution. And but seriously, folks, the element I think that we're all talking about is that it's much more the design patterns and the business analysis where the greatest leverage comes from. When you find the right seams, whether somebody's saying, okay, we're going to spend an extra week building messaging on top of Redis, or they actually use an appropriate messaging technology, that I'd say is actually probably the lesser concern. If your boundaries are right, then it's easier to swap out the technology behind the scenes. If your boundaries are wrong, you end up working really hard, and no amount of swapping technology is really going to help you. So I'd say that's probably the wrap up for me. Is kind of focus in on the analysis side, and technology-wise, it can and will sort itself out. You'll know the right questions to ask when selecting a certain piece of technology.